Zoom all that often. So,
I
um,
use it often, and I still sometimes feel like I'm looking at it for the first time, so no worries.
well, they're all slightly different.
If there's anything I should do. Oh, there we go.
Okay. So is it displaying properly?
Yep, looks good to me.
Okay. Um, okay. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Beth Schlimm. I'm the state herpetologist with the Department of Natural Resources. I am part of the Natural Heritage Program. So our group really covers all of the non-game species, really focusing more on the rare, threatened, and endangered species of animals and plants. And we are in the midst of our second revision of our state wildlife action plan. This is a pretty big lift, and um, it really is the document that allows us to do everything that we do in this program and gets us the funding that we need to do it. So um, I think particularly in the current political climate, it's probably a good thing for us to be really transparent about, what we're doing, how we're spending our funds, and, what we're really accomplishing. So um, I hope it's somewhat interesting. I've tried to throw in a bunch of photos to at least keep your interest in some of the drier parts. Okay.
I just threw the current version of the swap in the chat in case people want to see what
Okay.
this is for context.
Okay. So, as I said, this is going to be the third iteration of our state wildlife action plan. The 2015 revision that was done was really a huge overhaul of the first version. This current overhaul or this current revision is um, really sort of refining things and more of an update of things that are becoming, more of an emerging threat, but less of like a structural change to the document. So a lot of the changes that I'm going to focus on in this presentation are really more in terms of, what threats we think are going to be more of an issue in the next 10 years. And then again, refining that list of our state species of greatest conservation need. Um, and just as an overarching, purpose for the State Wildlife Action Plan, it's our guidance document. It really gives us our marching orders for what we do as part of the Natural Heritage Program. Okay, so the first swap was put out in 2005. I'm just going to refer to SWAP, not State Wildlife Action Plan, because I'll get too tongue-tied. In 2015, we did our first revision, which was a big one. And we're really in the middle of our second revision that needs to be done by October. So, to this point, we've had a few rounds of meetings. For the Herps, we've really just had one big meeting with, experts and conservation partners to mostly refine our species of greatest conservation need list. But we started to dig into the threats a little bit more, and we may end up having a second meeting to do some more work on that part of the plan in the future. So I do want to emphasize that this is not like a regulatory document. This is really just to sort of lay out our priorities and conservation actions that we want to take in the next 10-year period. And like I said, it really drives our focus and provides guidance for the projects that we're working on, but also things that our conservation partners are working on. So the three main components that I'm going to touch on today, and really the three components that I'm most interested in, in my role as herpetologist are our species of greatest conservation need, the key wildlife habitats that those species are using, and then the endless list of threats and, the conservation actions that we really want to focus on. I'm sorry, my photos, oh, there we go. Um, so I do want to emphasize that I'm saying we, when I say we, I'm referring to the Natural Heritage Program, but also to, an endless list of conservation partners. That's, NGOs, federal partners, universities, a lot of grad student work. So for the 2015 revision, the Heritage Program. This was before my time, but they worked with over 150 organizations and over 180 individuals as part of that revision process, and coming up with a list of, SGCN and conservation actions and threats. We're currently in the middle of this process right now, so I imagine for 2025 we'll probably surpass those numbers, but I don't have exact stats yet. And I do think there's a chance that this group might be involved in conversations. I know our swap coordinator mentioned having stakeholder meetings or stakeholder information sessions at some point. And I believe the Natural History Society of Maryland at least was in that list of stakeholders to include. So keep an eye out for that. Okay, so why is this plan so important? Really the main thing is that it is the thing that gets us the funding to do what we do. We use a lot of state wildlife grant funding, and in order to get that funding, each state is required to submit one of these state wildlife action plans. Just as a little bit of background on the SWIG funds, they're distributed annually by U.S. Congress. They're meant to benefit species that are not hunted or fished, and that 10-year renewal is a requirement for getting those funds annually. The SWIG funds are apportioned using a formula that's based on the land area of your state as well as your population. And you would think that those funds would be relatively stable based on that formula, but unfortunately the overall pot has continued to shrink since this was first put into place in 2002, I think. So each year they get whittled down a little bit more. But we end up having, a longer list of threats and species that we need to sort of spread those funds out for. So we do our best. I want to take just a brief moment to talk a little bit about our budget. Again, our leadership has really sort of encouraged us to talk about this a little bit more. Mostly just to emphasize, I think we're pretty good at covering a lot of species, a lot of habitat management and restoration work with relatively little funding, specifically for these species that aren't eligible for some of our other pots of money. So for herps in particular, we're really looking at using state wildlife grant funds. And then there's also a pot called competitive state wildlife grant funding. So this is just, as I understand it, a chunk of those SWIG funds that is withheld, and then it's apportioned based on a competitive in a competitive nature. So we recently put in a proposal for a competitive SWIG grant to work with box turtle, spotted turtle, and wood turtle, really focusing on sort of disease sampling and developing some guidelines for repatriating animals, due to confiscations. So this year, that competitive SWIG pot of money was $7 million. But it's I think there were 43 applications across the country that went in. And so that 7 million gets, broken up into typically $1 million chunks. So of the 43, there'll probably be 7 projects that get funded. So it's pretty cutthroat. Our biggest source of funding is Pittman-Robertson. This comes from a tax on guns and ammunition, and it's really just birds, mammals, habitat management for those groups that are eligible to use that pot of money. And then the other source that we can potentially use is the chickadee checkoff, the tax checkoff, in case you're not aware of that. Keep an eye out for that on your TurboTax. That money goes to the Natural Heritage Program and I believe the Chesapeake Bay Trust. So I just wanted to include this slide to just give you the heads up if you've never looked at the State Wildlife Action Plan. There's a lot of great information about, land use in the state, land use change, land preservation, as well as our waterscape. So there's a lot of really great background information about the state. But I'm not going to wade into any of this for this talk tonight. Okay, so, one of the most important aspects of our SWAP is our species of greatest conservation need list. This name is pretty self-explanatory. These are the species that we believe, based on conversations internally, or conversations with experts, these are the animals that are facing the most threat and certainly need the most attention in terms of, inventory and monitoring, habitat management, restoration work, that type of thing. There's really no real strict set of guidelines for what says, an animal can go on a species of greatest conservation need list. Anything federally protected automatically goes on the list, but the list is really up to the discretion of the states. So, in general, we're looking at as much as we can say and are confident, the abundance of the species, what the population trends are thought to be, how well do we understand the threats? So number of threats, the immediacy, this like spatial extent of those threats, state responsibility. So that's really just looking at is there like a pretty restricted range in your state? Is it, relatively rare, something that you really want to keep close tabs on? And then trends in habitat as well, habitat availability, what are, management and restoration needs for that species. So in 2015, our list included 26 reptiles and 19 amphibians. We're still finalizing our list as it currently stands for 2025. We have 31 reptiles and 19 amphibians. I've got the tables up. I'll give you guys a quick sec to sort of look through these while I take a sip of my drink. But anything in red text is being removed from the SGCN list, and anything in green is being added with this go round. And if anyone has questions that they want to address sort of as we go through this, I'm fine, taking questions as they pop up. I just can't see the chat. Are there any questions about the amphibians before I move you over to reptiles?
I don't see anything in the chat, Beth. If
Okay.
I do, I'll let you know.
All right.
All right.
Sorry, I'm a little late. Um, I didn't see the cheat mountain on the salamanders.
We don't have them in Maryland.
Oh, okay. So it goes in West Virginia, but I thought it bled into Maryland. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay.
I wish we had them.
Yeah, right.
Okay, and here's our reptile list.
Wow, you're adding the snapper?
So that's not for sure yet. I think we need to have some conversations with fisheries. But the impetus for including that on the list was that, if it's something that's being harvested, we need to be able to track, what's being harvested, what the
Right.
population trends are looking like. That species is regulated by fisheries. To my knowledge, we don't really
Yes.
get that level of information, from the harvest of that species. So
Right.
for now, we're putting it on. We do intend to have conversations with fisheries staff about this. It doesn't mean anything to have them on the list. It doesn't change regulations.
Okay.
But it does, it allows us to spend money if we wanted to do research and some, inventory and monitoring work for that
Sure.
species. Having it on this list allows us to do that.
Yeah, I agree with the other ones. The other ones are fine. It's just a
Mhm.
snapper was pretty common.
I'm a little
They are.
surprised to see the copperhead.
So copperhead we had on there because we're interested in doing more snake fungal disease work, and we want to be able to spend funds like specific to that species. Also, we're a little unsure about poaching with that species. We have information from neighboring states that there's been an uptick with timber rattlesnake poaching. Just sort of being a little cautious, putting it on there in case we want to do some monitoring, on both of those fronts with the copperhead.
Sorry. So the red is you're taking them off, right?
Yes. Yep.
So the coastal plain milk, isn't that an integrate?
No, so to address this, we've put Eastern milk snake on the list.
Oh, I see. So you're counting them all the same as Eastern milk.
Yes. Yep.
I understand. Okay, now
Yeah.
I get it.
Yep.
And pine snakes were never in Maryland, but maybe a million years ago.
A million years ago. Yeah. So we're taking them off.
Okay, okay. No, I'm just making sure that I'm not going crazy. Okay.
Nope. Yeah. You got it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay. So another relatively big change for the swap this year is there's a whole new category that we're looking at. This is the State Assessment Priority Species. These are our SAPs. So these are species that we're interested in, but really we're kind of starting from scratch. We really need baseline level data. We don't even know enough to say that they belong or don't belong on the SGCN list. So there's sort of three, I'm just going to read from these because they're, relatively specific. The purposes for this list are to refine the SGCN list, ensure, by putting them in this category where we're going to start collecting, hopefully, more baseline data, we can ensure that Maryland species most in need of like basic life history information, population size, trends, what are the threats, they have their own designated category that we can really focus on. And then, really having this separate list allows us to focus funding to kind of get at the most basic life history information, distribution, trends for this list. And it's a relatively short one. Currently, we've just got mid-Atlantic coast leopard frog, southern two-line salamander. There is a somewhat credible record of three-line salamander that we want to investigate. And then we have our big question mark siren population that we want to potentially dig into, although it's not a terribly high priority for us. We don't believe it's a native population. Okay, were there any questions about the SAPs before I move on? Okay. So we also have a section of the swap that focuses on key wildlife habitats. So these are the habitats that are really a focus for us because they're so important to our species of greatest conservation need. In 2015, we identified 59 key wildlife habitats, both aquatic and terrestrial. I imagine that number is going to stay the same in this go round. But I did want to note, if you're looking at the plan, our community ecologist, now our restoration ecologist, did some really great write-ups for all of the key wildlife habitats that just includes like basic information about the sites, what vegetation you're likely to find there, and then associations of our different groups for the species of greatest conservation need. Okay, so the threats and conservation action section is by far, this is my first time going through this revision. This is the hardest part of this whole thing. I think everyone on this call probably spends a lot of time thinking about the threats to reptiles and amphibians, all wildlife really, but it's hard to whittle down that list, and we'll never be like completely comprehensive with it. So what we're really trying to do is identify the threats and specific actions to address those threats that are manageable. I wouldn't say bite-sized, but things that we feel we can reasonably attempt to accomplish within a 10-year period, either ourselves or with those, our conservation partners. This is just a snip from the plan. from the 2015 plan. So for each group, we've got the threat, a like relatively brief description of the threat, and then a specific conservation action that we think should be addressed to address that threat. And these are broken down, broadly. So we've got a whole table for just reptiles and amphibians as a whole, and then it's broken down for salamanders, turtles, frogs and toads, etc. There are some actions and threats where we specifically call out individual species. But in the 2015 plan, a lot of them were more general, just, reptiles and amphibians, or the group as a whole.
Hey, Beth, what, I'm not sure what P and X means.
Oh,
Um,
yes. So,
Action priority type. I'm not sure.
yeah. Um, P essentially means it's a priority.
Okay,
X means it's something we should consider, but not necessarily a high priority.
got it. Okay, great. Thank you.
So this is one of the worksheets we're working from for the 2025 revision. And we're trying to dig down a bit more with this go around. So in terms of identifying the priority, we're looking at spatial extent of the threat, severity of the threat, immediacy, and then the overall impact of the threat, either on a group or on an individual species. So trying to be more specific with it, and the way that these different threat categories, it's really sort of automated. So there's different categories. You select what category you believe this threat to be, and then it spits out what your action priority should be. So we've got high, medium, and low, I believe. I think there's 3. So it gets a little more specific than the last one did, which I think is a good thing. Okay, I think that's a lot to say for this. Another, sort of set of changes I wanted to talk about with the threats and the conservation actions section are just some things that a few categories that we're trying to get more specific with this go round, either as a threat or in terms of the conservation actions we want to tackle in this next 10-year period. So emerging diseases is really a big one for us. I think in the last plan, rhinovirus was specifically called out, and maybe snake fungal disease. I can't quite remember. But this go around, we're really trying to get specific with it. So focusing on really surveillance in general, but calling out rhinovirus, mycoplasma, herpes virus, imidomyces, and BSAL. We really want to be more proactive this go around, in terms of, the surveillance and monitoring. We're also going to try and have a relatively long list of specific actions to, focus efforts on illegal collection and trade. This includes, education and training, education for the general public, just to let them know. I think a lot of folks don't understand that this is an issue, illegal collection and illegal trade. I currently do a lot of outreach with like master naturalists, and I have like a whole section where I talk about this and really emphasize, like, if you see something, say something. And this is why it's really important, as Tim was saying, that you keep your locations, to yourself. Even if you think it's someone that you can trust, we really don't want these locations getting out, even for more common species. I think we're hoping to do more training with our partners, internally. So I've had requests from some of our response staff that have had to deal with cases involving turtles in the last year, with our natural resources police. And then we definitely have some actions specific to, addressing what are the things we need to do, like post confiscation. This has been like a huge burden on us. We've only had in the last 10-year period, like one really big confiscation that we've had to deal with, at least internally, in the heritage program. But it's a huge financial burden. It's a huge time suck. And so we want to make sure that we're covered if we need to spend funds on, things like repatriation, disease testing to say that we can do repatriation of these confiscated animals. So It's certainly something that we're taking really seriously, and we want to make sure that we're setting ourselves up to be able to handle these confiscations when they do come, because it's an issue that's being taken more seriously at the federal level. You know that Fish and Wildlife is getting really good at intercepting these, um, shipments either coming in or going out, particularly like in New York and California. So if they're going to do their part and get these animals, and our, local natural resources police are able to do that as well, we want to be able to do our part to take them in as much as we can, and, where possible, get them back out into the wild. Um, yeah, and I will say that the illegal collection and trade and the emerging disease, those tie together. That's a whole different talk, but when we're talking about repatriation as part of that illegal collection and the conservation actions, we're really looking at disease as a big part of that decision-making process. Okay, so I will say that I think in the last 10 years, in that 2015 period, we really spent a lot of time doing inventory and monitoring work for a number of species, which is really important work to do. But I think now that we've got a lot of that information for a set of species that we've really been focused on, I think we can shift that effort more to management and stewardship. So we've got some specific actions called out for things like, bog turtle, box turtle, some nest management work for, wood turtle, spotted turtle, some tiger salamander habitat management. Um, I think it's really important. We have a lot of conservation plans that have been developed, somewhat recently. So we want to make sure we're putting effort into implementing those plans, and really following through on the actions that are specifically called out in those plans is really important and critical, both for those populations and for their habitats. And then lastly, we've got a lot of actions that are a little more technology heavy. So we're trying to use more automatic, um, or sorry, I've got a brain fart. Um, Audio recording units, cameras, and then eDNA work. With the thinking, with technology like this, we can work smarter, not harder, but also recognizing that these are really expensive. And so we're going to have to get creative, probably track down some external funding in addition to the state wildlife grants that we'll get as part of this plan. Yeah. Okay, and I think I probably covered most of this, but just as I've been sort of, working with colleagues through this current revision, some of the goals that have been like really important for me to follow through on are, again, just really identifying specific projects. Like, I want to come out of this revision with a task list for myself, for reptile and amphibian work, really focusing on things that I think are attainable, and reasonable to get done and to focus on in the next 10-year period. Again, really thinking about like this post inventory and monitoring effort that we saw with the last swap. What are the applied management techniques I can be using to benefit these species that we've been studying? And that really falls under implementing the conservation plans that have been laid out for us. I also think we need to figure out a better way to track our progress. Obviously, we've got like data from all of the work that we've been doing and from our partners, but a question I've heard from coworkers, a question that has come up a number of times during the meetings with experts and conservation partners as part of this process is like, what are the stats of what you've accomplished? And so I think maybe we need to find a way to be a little bit more quantitative in tracking, the specific actions that are called out and what we've accomplished and what we've done in the last 10-year period. So that's something I'm thinking about for this next round. And then just like in general, there's only so much that we can accomplish with this and the limited funding that we have. So I really want to work as much as possible with our conservation partners, whether that be, other state agencies, NGOs, and universities, as much as we can to get some of this work done. Okay, so I have just a couple of slides sort of highlighting some of the projects that we've worked on in the last 10-year period, but I guess I'll stop again in case there are any questions about what I've covered so far.
Here's one in the chat, Beth. How much is loss of habitat, especially ephemeral ponds, being explored? What about deer overgrazing in woodlands?
Um, I can't comment on the deer. I'm not sure that's necessarily anything that we'll call out specifically on our end of things. I mean, it really is more, I think that more falls under like the wildlife side of our unit, like designating areas and promoting hunting in certain areas where we know that's an issue. Maybe a conservation action could be like having better communication with those units to say, hey, we've got this rare thing here. The area is being like just totally overtaken and overbrowsed by deer. Can you put more people on this to sort of benefit this species? As far as, vernal pool habitat loss, we haven't had our key wildlife habitat meetings yet. We'll be having those soon. And I have a feeling that this is a topic that's going to get a lot of discussion. Um, Vernal pools have just been getting a lot of attention. The last two legislative sessions, bills have been proposed for vernal pool work and mapping and additional protection. We've also noticed with um, proposals for like mitigation work around like wetland mitigation. I've seen a couple projects that seem to really be excited about vernal pool construction, which I have mixed feelings about. I don't know how easy it is to do that well. Um, so something that we have talked about is trying to develop guidance for projects that want to do something like that, just to make sure that they're doing it properly, or at least hiring contractors that have done it and have been shown to do it well in the state. So it's kind of a non-answer. We haven't really talked about vernal pools specifically yet, but I do think it's something that we will spend a fair bit of time discussing when we get to that meeting step.
And I see, Richard, you had your hand up. What's your question?
I think Rick is muted.
Let's see if I can.
Should I just keep going, you think?
Yeah, unless Richard unmutes himself
Yeah,
or actually
I'm
puts it in the
trying to
chat.
unmute him.
Oh, there we go.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
This is a meandering question, but it'll get to Herps eventually. Although I'm shocked at your description of DNR funding in the beginning. As you have to bid for money. You don't have a line item on the state budget that funds these things. That's
Well, yeah, we don't, the Natural Heritage Program, we don't really, I think we get like a very small amount of general funds. I don't know that that's guaranteed every year, but we're primarily federally funded, which,
oh,
yeah, a lot of people don't know. And we
right.
do get some state wildlife grants automatically, but, they, to some degree, just cover the bare minimum. So we do have to go out competitively for additional funds as needed.
That sounds like such a tight thing. I love the DNR. They come to Conowingo Dam to sample fish every year. And the people there taught me how to tell a male from a female shad. You know how they do that?
I have no idea.
You squeeze the fish. If eggs
Oh,
come out, it's
Yeah.
a female. If milk comes out, it's a male. Anyway, if you look at the trails around Conowingo Dam on the Susquehanna right now, today, there's a couple miles blocked off because of avian flu. There's 100 or more dead black vultures down there. And I'd say out of the past 5 years, 4 years, it's been blocked off. So diseases like that are real. You already described some herp diseases, but if you read the signs on the block off, it says it's by the dam. operators, the company did that. It doesn't have DNR signs on there. What does the DNR do if there are threats which appear on private lands? Is there an authority that you can walk on there and do or say or suggest something, or do you just have to cold call them and say, can you help us with this? Or
Yeah, I mean, we don't, as biologists, we don't have the authority to go on private property without express permission. Um, NRP may have some ability to do that. I don't know for sure. But yeah, if we were to see signs of like dead birds or something, noted on a private property, we would have to reach out to the landowner and get permission to go in and investigate that.
what's the extent of herp diseases? You mentioned like 3 or 4.
Mhm.
They sound like they may be bacterial or something like that. Are they widespread or do they have a trend that anybody knows about yet?
So the big ones that have been getting attention with turtles and box turtles specifically are ranavirus is the big one. It's got a very high mortality rate. Herpes virus, mycoplasma. There are a few more that I think it's a little less known, um, you know, what the level of impact is for our species. But um, so those are sort of a growing focus. Amidomyces is a fungus that is not widespread yet. It's been an issue, I believe, mostly in captive populations of, just a suite of turtle species. There have been a few instances where it's popped up in the last like handful of years in wild populations of turtles. Um, it's a scary one because I don't know that there's really a good treatment for it. So again, that's one where we just want to have the ability to do as much surveillance as we can. Um, And then probably most terrifying of all would be B-cell if that made it to the United States. So um, we have that as a task to do surveillance. I think we still need to get a good feel for what our surveillance plan should look like at the state level. But there's been a lot of like really good research, lab-based research recently to identify um, which species native to the US would be most susceptible to B-cell if it were to make it here. And US Fish and Wildlife Service is working really, really hard to make sure that doesn't happen. There's a very, very small list of species that can be imported, salamander-wise, imported into the United States for the pet trade. And that list is largely based on the studies that have been done with B-Sal. So only letting in species that we know, aren't susceptible to B-Sal and aren't likely to be bringing it into the United States. So I don't know if that
Wow.
answers your question. That was kind of a ramble.
That's very, very thorough. It sounds like you're on top of all of it. One last quick thing, but what about birds and fish and what the DNR does with them? Do they have to make plans, 10-year plans like you're describing here also?
Yeah. All of our ologists are working on this plan. Like I'm just focused on herps here. But the swap, it covers birds, fish, mammals. I think this year there's actually a bigger chunk focusing on plants, which hasn't been the case in the past. Um, our botanists always get screwed in these things. I like have no room to complain about our funding because they get almost nothing. But so yeah, I'm just focusing on the reptiles and amphibians here, but it is a much broader plan than just what I'm talking about tonight.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. So before I go into these accomplishments, I specifically want to note that like I'm the new kid on the block. I think maybe many of you know Scott Smith. So the bulk of what I'm going to cover here is really his hard work and not mine. So I just want to make that clear before I start going through these slides. Okay, so a lot of our time in the last 10 years has been spent on the bog turtle. So this is a federally protected species. It's listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So we've been lucky enough to actually work to get 2 competitive state wildlife grants for this species, like almost back to back. I have to say the Northeast states really have their act together in terms of like working collaboratively, particularly when it comes to these regional turtle projects. And so we've been really successful in getting these like regional cooperative grants, just because we work so well together and, really have these conservation plans and recovery plans where we're sort of like ticking off actions, working together. So, a lot of the work and like conservation actions that get called out in our state plan are going to be called out in our neighboring states as well. So we do, as much as possible, try to work collaboratively with our neighboring states to accomplish some of these tasks too. So for bog turtle surveys, there was have been a couple of rounds of pretty comprehensive inventory and monitoring work done for this species. The first being back in the 70s, and then again in the early 90s. So mid 2000s, or I guess it was probably 2013, 2014 when the first competitive state wildlife grant came in. So really a focus was to sort of redo that comprehensive survey, revisit these sites, see where we still have populations, what sort of habitat management work needs to be done at these sites. So Scott did a ton of survey work. I sort of came in at the tail end of the first grant, and have worked through the second competitive state wildlife grant. So it's a combination of visual surveys, so going out with volunteers. Tim's been out with us. He's a huge help. And phase 3, which is our trapping work that we do on larger sites or sites where the vegetation is just a little too thick to be able to survey it visually, and to do that well. We've also done a couple of research projects, mostly telemetry based. One that I think was really interesting, and I wanted to talk about, is a project where we basically monitored turtles through a couple of stream restoration projects. In the last handful of years, it seems like it's slowed down now, but there was a period of time where we were just getting slammed with environmental review for stream restoration projects, that were, happening really, really close to some of our bog turtle sites, and we had some serious concerns about them. Mainly being with all of this heavy equipment in the wetland, or not in the wetland, but relatively close to the wetland, is that disturbance going to essentially disturb the turtles to the point that they're, moving up and out of their tunnels where they're overwintering. Just because we don't want turtles to be active during this work, we set time of year restrictions a lot of the time that basically say, you can do this work, but it needs to be done during the winter time when we know that the turtles are down and they're not likely to be up and wandering into the, limits of disturbance for the project. So we had a few sites where we had stream restoration work going on. And what we did to investigate the level of disturbance for the turtles was to attach transmitters to the turtles, so we could track their locations to their overwintering sites and really sort of monitor locations through the winter. We also put eye buttons on the turtles. These are just, little circular units that you can attach with epoxy. The ones that we had really just recorded time and temperature. We also put these eye buttons out in the wetland. So in tunnels, just in locations that didn't have turtles, just so we could get a water temperature in those tunnels. And then we would have them on the surface so we could get the air temperature. And the idea was that we can't track the turtles every day. We don't have the time and money to do that. So we can't see if they're actually moving, as much as we'd like to have that information. But we thought that we could use temperature data to tell us whether a turtle was leaving their tunnel, presumably because they were being disturbed by the construction activities. So what we expected to see if a turtle was disturbed is that the temperature on their eye button would like very quickly drop, because we expected the ambient temperature to be colder than that like more stable water temperature that they're spending their winter in. So you can see on this slide, the bottom right, this is just a figure from one of our female turtles at one of these sites. The first red line is just showing the start date for hibernation. The second line is the start of the restoration work. And then the third red line is the end of the restoration work. So you can see it's not completely stable. There are some changes, but there are no like very distinct spikes one way or another, which is what we would expect to see if a turtle was disturbed moving up out of the tunnel. We would see a drop. So you'd see sort of a spike downward. And it's that orange line that you should be focused on. So that was a good thing. And this held true really across all of our sites. So this was really useful for us because it told us that, you know, the recommendations that we had been making in terms of avoidance and minimization measures for this species and these stream restoration projects was really the right call. Having the work done in the winter time, despite the fact that this heavy equipment was going to be doing this work in close proximity to the wetland, it wasn't disturbing turtles, at least to a degree that it was influencing their behavior and causing them to move out of their tunnels, you know, which really could have been a death sentence for some of these animals, depending on whether or not they could find another suitable location to overwinter for the remainder of the winter. Okay, and then the other thing I just want to mention for bog turtles is we, in this second competitive state wildlife grant, have really spent a lot of time and energy on restoration work. We have a really good feel for what the habitat needs to look like for the species and what vegetation is really most problematic for these sites. So this is just a series of photos from one of the sites where the cattail had really gotten out of control. There was a pond on the site that had backed up, and the cattail exploded over a season or two. So we knocked it back pretty dramatically with cattail. We never want to completely, you know, take it out of the system, but we do like to keep it at a minimum. Tackling this species is really hard work. It's very tedious. We've done this at a number of sites now, but basically what we do is we go through with brush cutters, we cut it, and then we have a group kind of go through behind, and they just dribble a little bit of herbicide on the cut stump surface. We like to do 2 treatments a year. It takes 2 to 3 years to really sort of get it under control, but it works really, really well. So at this site in particular, we're really, you know, back to a maintenance stage. So every couple of years we might go through and cut and treat some things, but I think at this point we've got it under control enough that we don't need to be going out there annually to tackle this. Okay, so I mentioned snake fungal disease briefly earlier when I was talking about the diseases. This is an example of a project that you know, one of our conservation partners took on. So this was done really as a pilot with the Smithsonian. Their curator, one of their curators and vets, they visited a couple of sites out in Western Maryland, and they were swabbing copperheads and timber rattlesnakes for snake fungal disease. This was really just to kind of test the method and see if we were able to detect it in our Maryland populations, and we were. Timbers tested positive at both sites, and copperheads tested positive at one site. There were some snakes that had minor visible lesions, but nothing terribly dramatic, which is a good thing. We are hoping to, you know, get some funding set aside to really sort of scale this project up a bit more, visit additional sites, maybe do repeated sampling, you know, in the spring and the fall. But this was, you know, kind of a good start to get things rolling. Okay, terrapins and turtle reduction devices were another big project. This species needs a lot of work, especially when it comes to, I think, education and outreach and enforcing our regulations. Some of that is out of our control, you know, that really is going to fall on Natural Resources Police, but I think we can do a better job of really just making sure that people understand what the regulations are, why they're so important, and I'll talk a little bit on the next slide about, you know, kind of what we're seeing on the ground when it comes to enforcement, and, you know, how people are following the regs. But I just want to point out the photo on the bottom left. A natural resources police officer contacted me last January. This was a crab trap that one of his friends had wash up on his property. He lived on the Chester River, and it had 50 dead terrapins in it. You could see the remnants of the bycatch reduction devices, or the turtle reduction devices in the trap, but they were the metal BRDs, so they had basically rusted away. But so a project that Scott started in 2009, and he got through several iterations of this, of sampling, involved going out with natural resources police and basically pulling pots from docks. I think there were 7 locations around the bay that he hit. And we have to have natural resource police involvement for this work. We can't just go out and pull a pot, you know, without talking to the landowner first and getting their permission, but NRP is able to do that. So for this work, we, and I only helped in 2016, but we went out to 7 sites with NRP. We had like set stretches of river, and pulled as many pots as we could find, you know, glass pots that were sitting, you know, up on piers. And we were looking at a couple of things. Most importantly, you know, how many pots actually had bycatch reduction devices or turtle reduction devices in the pot installed properly. And then some of the other regs that we were looking at were, you can only fish 2 pots per property, per pier. You know, were there properties that had more than 2 pots being fished? And then did the pots have proper registry or DNR ID on them? So honestly, the results were pretty depressing. There's kind of been a slow trend toward, you know, people being in compliance, but it's still, in 2016, was incredibly low in terms of percentage of pots across the board with bycatch reduction devices installed in them. The rate of compliance was highest in 2016, but it was still only 53%. Looking at the other examples of non-compliance, there were between 2009 and 2016, this stayed relatively stable, but about 20% of pots that were pulled, or properties that were visited, had more than 2 pots being fished. I think an issue that we identified was that there are a lot of piers that have multiple slips. And so you've got like a set of townhouses or something. Maybe you have like 4 together. You would have like each of those slips fishing multiple pots, when technically you can only have 2 altogether. Hopefully that makes sense. And then again, only the number that have the proper crab pot registry or DNR ID was really, really low. It was 0% in 2012, and it was only, you know, almost 6% in 2016. So the other aspect to this study was, you know, we've got a sort of a picture of what's happening on the water, but we wanted to see how that matches up with basically what's available in terms of purchasing these pots and BRDs. So we visited as many bait shops as we could possibly find in the state. And you're not required, Maryland does not require shops to sell crab pots with BRDs installed, which is a problem. But we wanted to visit these shops and actually see, are they selling pots with BRDs installed? Are they selling pots without? If they're selling them without the BRDs installed, do they at least have BRDs available for purchase separately? And so it was a real mix. This was the sampling for this part of the project was only done in 2009 and 2016. And there was an increase, you know, in 2009 during the first sampling event. Only 17% of shops were selling BRDs or crab pots with BRDs installed. That jumped to about 67% in 2016. we did as much as possible. We tried to encourage the bait shop owners. We handed out flyers and just kind of said, can you post this? If you're selling crab pots without BRDs, can you post this near that stack of pots? Just so people are aware of what they need to do, you know, to kind of get these up to code. Some people said they were willing to do it, others weren't. And yeah, it was a real mix. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever get to a point where we can require crab pots to be sold with BRDs. But I think there are some groups out there that are trying to kind of do what they can to get around this. The Maryland Coastal Bays program in particular, they've been going out for grants, I think through like one of the Walmart foundations. And for the last couple of years, they've gotten a chunk of money. They've purchased a ton of BRDs, and then they go to local bait shops. Their volunteers go to local bait shops that aren't selling them the crab pots with BRDs installed, and they install them for them. You know, they don't charge them for the BRDs. They just want them going out, you know, so that they're ready to go. And I certainly don't blame people, particularly those that are, you know, just kind of coming through, they're vacationing, they stop at Walmart or they stop at a local bait shop and they pick up a crab pot. I think it's reasonable to expect that what you're purchasing is ready to go. So we just need to figure out a better way of reaching people that are buying these, to let them know, you know, what they're expected to do if they're buying crab pots that don't have BRDs installed.
Beth, do we, in terms of like the shop owners who were not on board with providing those, like what is the resistance? Do we know why people are not buying into this?
So the
If that makes sense.
the messaging we were getting from the bait shop owners that were selling them without is that if they installed the BRDs themselves, they'd have to jack up the cost of the crab pot, and they didn't want to do that because they were afraid it would basically turn off consumers and they would just go elsewhere because they didn't want to pay that much for the crab pot.
Is it a really significant expense? I mean, or
You know, I don't think it, you know, again, back in 2016, I don't know what they cost now, but I think in 2016, like some of the shops were selling them for like, I don't know, like $1.50 a piece. They weren't that expensive.
that's what I'm thinking,
You
right?
can
Not much.
technically make them yourself, but I always recommend people purchase the plastic ones over the metal ones just because they're gonna last way longer. Um, Interestingly, I did have a nonprofit reach out like a month or so ago that's interested in 3D printing them and like making them available for free to the public, which I think is like a fantastic idea. So I don't know, I was thinking like how we scale that up, like whether I don't know how 3D printing works, but like can we like put together specs and like send this out to folks or post it on social media? Like if you have a 3D printer and you want to help conservation, like here's something that you can do. So I think we can get creative. We just kind of need to put our heads together and figure out the best way to tackle this
That's
issue.
really cool, and I feel like people would want to help with that. A lot of people have
Yeah.
a 3D printer, and once you have one, you're like, what do I do with this? You're always looking
Well,
for more projects. So yeah,
that's exactly what he said. Yeah. It's kind of funny. Okay. So I think the last one I have here is our tiger salamander work. Again, this is another species that has really had a lot of inventory and monitoring work done in this last swap round. Um, so, you know, going out doing trapping for adults, a lot of egg mass surveys, and we've also done a fair bit of Delmarva Bay management, both at sites that we know have tiger salamanders, but also at one of our properties. Um, we've tried to start a project to sort of like connect wetlands. So we've got a few that we know are occupied and are used for breeding by tiger salamanders, but we're trying to open up and restore a couple of sites in between those just to sort of build a little bit more connection between the two. So, you know, the management for these sites just, it's pretty simple. It's, you know, removing woody vegetation from the wetland itself. Some of these we're doing a little bit of work like up on the sandy ridges, on the margins of the sites just to get rid of less desirable species. You know, things like a lot of sweet gum, some holly, we're trying to knock back, and just sort of releasing the oaks that we really want to see, you know, more on those sandy rims. So, sorry, I apologize. I don't have a lot of detail for this project. I just sort of ran out of time pulling this stuff together, but there has been quite a bit of work done with tiger salamander, and Scott does have some data to show that in sites where there has been like management in the past, he was starting to see like an uptick in egg masses, presumably in response to some of that habitat management work, improving conditions at those sites. So we will certainly be continuing that work moving forward. And that's all I had. So I've got my email here if anyone is ever interested in reaching out. Feel free to bug me. I'm always happy to chat herps. Or yeah, I guess I'll take any more questions if you have them.
Thank you so much, Beth.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you just briefly explain for those of us who don't know why it's so important to control the cattails that you mentioned a few slides back?
Yeah. So for the bog turtles, we do a fair bit of cattail work just because, I mean, for us, it doesn't seem that way, but for a bog turtle, a dense stand of cattail really is sort of a closed canopy for them because they're just, you know, they're so small. And so we want to knock that back so that we can just really promote more of the herbaceous vegetation that we want to see at those sites. You know, mainly tussock sedge. And like I said, you know, it can be there. We just want it in like lower quantities at the sites where we're detecting it.
Got it. That makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great presentation. Thank you so much. And thank you for the work that you do and for taking the time to tell us about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Beth Schlimm, everybody, state herpetologist, Maryland Department of Natural Resources. If there are no other questions, all right, thanks everyone. See you next time.